Hello, welcome to the Daily Politics. Jeremy Corbyn declares he's not a pacifist as he pledges a robust, independent foreign policy with no hand-holding with US President Donald Trump. President Trump lays into the former director of the FBI, saying he's a showboat and a grandstander as he attempts to close down the row over his sacking of James Comey. The opinion polls failed to predict David Cameron's general election win 2 years ago, so can we trust the polls this time around? And how will Brexit Britain fare in tomorrow's Eurovision Song Contest in Kiev? All that in the next hour, and with us for the whole of the programme today, The Guardian columnist Polly Toynbee and Christian May, editor of City AM. Welcome to both of you. Let's kick off with the news overnight from Washington that Donald Trump has described the former director of the FBI, whom he fired earlier this week, as a showboat and a grandstander. In an interview with NBC News, President Trump talked about his reasons for firing James Comey.
But regardless of recommendation, I was going to fire Comey, knowing there was no good time to do it. And in fact, when I decided to just do it, I said to myself, I said, you know, this Russia thing with Trump and Russia is a made-up story. It's an excuse by the Democrats for having lost an election. He's a showboat. He's a grandstander. The FBI has been in turmoil. You know that. I know that. Everybody knows that. I know that I'm not under investigation. Me, personally. I'm not talking about campaigns. I'm not talking about anything else. I'm not under investigation.
Donald Trump there. Well, Polly Toynbee, we'll look at it in bits in just a moment, but your first impressions of that interview?
Well, you always think you can't be more shocked by Trump, and then you are more shocked by Trump. And what he's done this week has been utterly astounding. And he's now sacked everybody who's been remotely involved in investigating the Russian links with his campaign. And, you know, this sacking is utterly disgraceful and extraordinary. He's given quite different reasons why. In the first place, it was because of, bizarrely, the investigation into Hillary Clinton. And now he says it's this Trump-Russia thing.
Which bit worries you, if any of it worries you, Christian May, at all about that interview? As Polly said, he's changed the story, if you like, for the reasons for sacking James Comey. He's obviously insulted the now former FBI director. And he has admitted that he had dinner and conversations with James Comey where he asked the FBI director, was he under investigation, which is certainly unethical, if not illegal.
Yes, there's certainly fresh questions about conversations Trump had with Comey in the run-up to the sacking. I still think at the moment it's too early to say whether what lies at the root of this is conspiracy or incompetence. It's on any given day, I think, difficult to tell with Trump exactly which of those two factors is the great motivator, because it could just be that he is erratic and he is unpredictable. If it was the case that he fired the head of the FBI because he felt the head of the FBI was getting too close to him, it's a fairly extraordinary leap to assume that that would then put the issue away.
Well, that, of course, is the question. You see,
Yes.
it's not going to end the row. I mean, one wonders, how does he get himself, extricate himself, if you like, from this situation?
It depends whether the investigation continues and what it eventually turns up with. I mean, I was in Washington reporting, one of my earlier jobs, at the time of Watergate, when Archibald Cox, the special investigator, was sacked by Nixon, and it feels very like that. You know, it feels like the act of somebody who is desperate, and desperate that the investigation shouldn't continue. After all, if he has nothing to hide, let it continue.
Yes, although it does fit with a pattern of being unpredictable, of being erratic, of changing his mind. And of course, he still denies that he has any direct dealings or properties in Russia. Is that going to continue to hold that line? And is Washington and sort of capitalism establishment reeling from this? Will they come after Trump over this?
I think a lot of people already are, and they're determined to. His critics, of course, of which there are many, are determined to draw the Watergate comparison. It was fun to note the Nixon Presidential Library saying yesterday that
Yeah.
Nixon never fired the head of the FBI.
Yes, it wasn't exactly the same.
It wasn't exactly the same. Obviously, this is going to run and run and run, and whether there will be fresh congressional hearings, whether there will be legal action taken against the president or those around him, depends. I mean, Trump obviously feels that he is relatively insulated. I mean, he is. You could say that
Well, he must do. He must feel that to some extent, mustn't he?
he has that confidence, whether it's wholly misplaced and purely down
He's
to the quirks of
insulated.
his personality, or whether it's because actually he thinks there's nothing here, this is politically motivated.
No, I think he's purely insulated by his support base and the fact that they will believe anything he says. He says fake news, nothing to look at here, and a huge groundswell of the people who voted for him will always back him, whatever he says, however bad, even if he says one thing one day and the opposite the next. It's extraordinary.
And that's true in terms of popular support, but it might not hold in Washington, where, of course, there is a robust establishment who have many levers to pull if they do want to make life increasingly difficult for him.
What he calls the swamp.
Yeah.
Let's move on from the swamp to our daily quiz. And the question for today is, how much is this general election here in the UK likely to cost? Is it A, £123 million, B, £143 million, C, £350 million, or D, €100 billion? And at the end of the show, we'll see if Polly and Christian can work out the numbers, and perhaps we'll do a whip round and see if they'll donate to the coffers. Now, Jeremy Corbyn has been giving a speech setting out his views on defence and foreign policy. The Labour leader is a former chairman of the Stop the War coalition, but today he's been explaining the circumstances in which he would countenance military action. In his speech, Jeremy Corbyn declared, "I am not a pacifist." He argued that military force can be justified if it's used as a genuine last resort and in compliance with international law. He also took aim at the foreign policy of recent years. He said the war on terror has failed. And he said that the bomb first, talk later approach to security and defence has also failed. Jeremy Corbyn turned his guns on both Theresa May and Donald Trump. He said there will be no more hand-holding with Donald Trump if he becomes Prime Minister. And the UK will pursue an independent foreign policy. But the Conservatives have responded to Mr Corbyn's speech, saying that the Labour leader has spent a lifetime trying to disarm Britain. Well, Jeremy Corbyn has been giving his speech at the Chatham House think tank in central London. Let's take a look.
War on terror has been driven, which has driven these interventions, has not succeeded. It has not increased our security at home. In fact, many would say just the opposite. It's caused destabilisation and devastation abroad. And last September, the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Select Committee published a report on the Libyan war, which David Cameron, as Prime Minister, promoted our intervention in. They concluded the intervention led to political and economic collapse, humanitarian and migrant crises, and fueled the rise of ISIS in Africa and across the Middle East.
Jeremy Corbyn giving that speech. Well, we've been joined from Leeds by Jeremy Corbyn's Shadow Minister for Peace and Disarmament, Fabian Hamilton. Welcome to the Daily Politics, Fabian. Jeremy Corbyn said today that he will do everything necessary to protect this country. What does that mean?
Well, that means not leaving the country defenceless. It means ensuring our armed forces are properly supplied and properly armed. It means spending the 2% that we're committed to through the NATO treaty on our armed services and on our defence. Defence of this country, defence of the realm, is safe with the Labour Party. It always has been, it always will be.
But what about a strike against the leader of the so-called Islamic State? Jeremy Corbyn, as you know, was asked recently if he would authorise such a strike against the leader of ISIS if the British security forces got that intelligence, and he didn't answer the question. Would that be necessary in your mind to protect this country?
Well, I think this is a theoretical situation. I think it's very hard to say until you're actually faced with the intelligence and with the facts. It's all very well saying, would you do this in these circumstances? Nobody knows what those circumstances are going to be, so I think it's an impossible question to answer, frankly.
Well, except that if you are saying that you would do everything, a Labour government would do everything in its power to protect the UK and Britain, if a member of ISIS in Syria was actively planning a terrorist act on the streets of this country, would Prime Minister Corbyn authorise a strike on that individual or not? It may be hypothetical, but it's not that unrealistic.
Well, I can't possibly answer that question. But,
why not?
But because I don't know what the circumstances will be or the intelligence would be. But what I'd say is I can't see why Jeremy Corbyn would react in any different way to any other Prime Minister, Labour or Conservative, given the threat to this country.
So he would do what David Cameron did in that situation?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yes, so Prime Minister Corbyn would do the same as David Cameron did when he reported the drone strike, which killed a high-level of person in ISIS.
He may well do, but I mean, why are we talking about these kind of theoretical issues, and we have no idea what the circumstances may be, or what the intelligence would show, or what the military advice would be given to the Prime Minister of the day. But I can tell you that Jeremy Corbyn, along with every other member of the Labour Party and every Labour MP, holds the defence of the realm, the defence of this country, as a highest possible priority.
Right.
And we will do everything we can to defend the people of Great Britain.
Because people want to know and want to be able to trust a future Labour government that they would do the sorts of things that people would consider necessary to protect this country. Jeremy Corbyn also criticised what he called unilateral military action, which he said has become almost routine in recent years. So explain to us, does that mean that a future Labour government would always need full UN backing for any military action?
Well, I think it depends on the circumstances. We're a member of NATO, and we know that the NATO treaty means that an attack on one is an attack on all. So I wouldn't have thought if one of our members was attacked and the treaty was invoked that we would then necessarily go to the United Nations. Depends on the circumstances, doesn't it? But the defence of this country is an absolute priority for any party that wants to hold power and any government that is elected to power.
But if you're criticising unilateral military action, the sort of logic of that argument says that Britain wouldn't, maybe rightly or wrongly, but it wouldn't be prepared to take military action even if the UK was under threat in a unilateral way. And by leaving that unclear, doesn't that effectively give someone like Vladimir Putin a veto on the UK's foreign policy? Because given that Russia is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, you know, Russia doesn't respect our veto in Syria or Ukraine or Georgia, for example, but are you saying that we should always respect theirs?
Look, we should not embark on the kind of adventurism that we've seen in the past. The kind of adventurism that Jeremy quite rightly says means dropping the bombs first and asking the questions later. A lot of innocent people have been killed as a result of some of these strikes and some of these conflicts. And that's something we want to try and avoid. If we can see a conflict coming, we need to do everything we can through international fora, including the United Nations and NATO, to try and de-escalate that situation and stop the conflict happening in the first place.
Do you think talking and using the vehicle of the UN has been successful in de-escalating the Syrian crisis?
Well, of course it hasn't, but the UN has a really important role there. The problem with the Syrian crisis is that it's become so fragmented, so complicated, that it's almost impossible now to pick it apart. But the only solution is going to be through the United Nations. I can't see any other solution unless Turkey, Iran, Russia manage to find some conclusion between Syria and the ISIL factions and the other warlords there.
Except, as you say, you can only see the UN as a viable channel through which to direct foreign policy or any acts of military intervention. But what about humanitarian intervention? You'll remember, for example, Tony Blair intervened to stop Slobodan Milosevic attacking Albanian civilians in Kosovo. That was without the backing of the United Nations. Would Jeremy Corbyn ever do that for humanitarian reasons?
Yes, I think this country has a very good record in humanitarian interventions, and provided Parliament is consulted and approves it, then I see no reason why we should not take those interventions on if it's for pure humanitarian purposes, to save lives.
Right.
We're very good at doing this, and I think we've shown an example to other countries in the world.
Now, is Jeremy Corbyn saying today what he said in that speech at Chatham House, what he really personally thinks? Or is he saying what he feels he needs to say from a collective point of view for the Labour Party? He obviously, it seems, has changed his mind regarding NATO and defence spending. Let's just have a listen to what he said a few years ago.
Join every campaign, fight all the cuts except those in the armed forces where we want to see a few more cuts taking place and no more nuclear weapons. NATO was founded in order to promote a Cold War with the Soviet Union. That resulted in the formation of the Warsaw Pact. Come the end of the Cold War in 1990, that should have been the time for NATO to shut up shop, give up, go home and go away.
So does Jeremy Corbyn still think NATO should shut up shop and go away, as he said at the end of August 2014? It's not that long ago.
No, it isn't that long ago, but he wasn't leader of the Labour Party then. He's now the leader of a large political party that makes its decisions collectively.
So has he changed his mind? That's what I'm trying to ask. Has he changed his mind, or does he still hold that view, but he has been either forced or himself converted himself to thinking that that is not the right policy to represent the Labour Party?
He may well have changed his mind, or he may well still hold the same views. What I'm saying is that
you don't know.
No, of course I don't know. But what is very clear is that when you're the leader of a political party, you have to go along with the democratic decisions. You have to go along with the collective view, and the collective view is that we support NATO and we support remaining a member of NATO, and that is what Jeremy is promoting. And you know, I have my own particular views about disarmament or about nuclear weapons, but I go along with the majority. Parliament voted to renew Trident. Jeremy and I both walked through the lobby saying we shouldn't, but we accept that democratic decision and we will carry it out.
But there are some decisions that only a Prime Minister can make, and if you are putting yourself forward to be a future Prime Minister, your personal views are important because it goes to the very heart of your personal credibility when you're standing up in front of voters. 2014, 3 years ago, Jeremy Corbyn saying very passionately there that NATO should shut up shop and saying that the only cuts that he would support would be cuts to the armed forces, a direct contradiction of what you are saying in your manifesto.
But I'm sorry, are we really saying that it was 3 years ago, but are we really saying that when somebody says something 3 years ago, they're not entitled to change their mind, given how very, very huge a change Jeremy's role is now?
But he's held those views. You would accept he's held those views very consistently for his whole life. So in the last 3 years, he's had a radical change of heart.
Well, of course he has, because he never had the prospect of being the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And now that prospect is in view with a general election coming up in less than 4 weeks' time. So, of course, you've got to change your mind. You've got to take a much broader view of what your role now is.
Although you did say you weren't sure whether he changed his mind or whether he was just doing it for the democratic will of the Labour Party. Look, I suppose the question for people is, will they believe what you're saying? Will people trust that if he became Prime Minister that he would hold to those policies in the manifesto, or would he, under a comprehensive strategic defence review, try and go back to the policies that he actually believes?
Jeremy's a Democrat, like all of us, and he will go along with the democratic view of the Labour Party. Now, of course, there are decisions that are made in the seclusion of 10 Downing Street, but they're not made by the Prime Minister alone. They're made with a whole lot of advisors that advise about the common good, about the defence of the realm, about the important issues that a Prime Minister has to deal with. And it seems to me that you're trying to personalise this into the persona and the character of Jeremy Corbyn.
Well, he wants to be Prime Minister. I think that's fair.
No, but that's fine. But you have to accept that, of course, he's going to have a different view about how this country should be defended compared with when he was a backbencher and speaking for himself and his constituents alone. That will be a very, very different point of view to that of a party leader who's aspiring to be Prime Minister of this country.
Fabian Hamilton, thank you very much. Your reaction on that goes to the very heart of the matter. Can people, do you think, in your mind, trust Jeremy Corbyn and what he's saying today as Labour leader and as a future Prime Minister in this election campaign, or will they refer to the views that he has held over the last 30 years or so in Parliament?
I think it's a very difficult line to hold, that one between what he's been saying very passionately for 30 years and the position that he has now been forced to adopt as he leads a political party. I think Fabian held that line quite well, but the public will rightly look at 30 years of stump speeches and, indeed, 30 years, decades of dubious association with people who have meant this country harm. One only has to think about his support, quite vocal support, for the bombs and the bullets of the IRA, a time where he clearly felt that military action or armed action was justified in that conflict. So he can make a speech today, a month ahead of a general election, in which he seeks to reassure people that he does wish to protect the country. But if you've spent 30 years positioning yourself on the other side of that argument, then people will rightly question your sincerity.
Do you think this is a difficult area for Jeremy Corbyn to appear authentic, because he is a man who has always said, I stand by the principles that I have always held?
I think it is difficult for him, but I think what he said today is that would actually be very popular. I mean, if it weren't him saying it, I think almost everything that he said people would agree with. They don't want to be close to Trump. They don't trust him. They don't want any more involvement with the Middle East. They do regard it as having been an almost unmitigated disaster. They don't see any solutions in Syria or any particular reason why us adding a few bombs is going to solve that intractable problem. Unfortunately, because of his backstory, because of the clips you showed, people won't trust it coming from him. I mean, it's rather like Labour's manifesto. Really popular things, and nothing in there that would be unpopular.
Right, and just briefly before we go on to the front pages of the papers today, I mean, do we know anything more really about Theresa May's foreign policy? I mean, as Polly Toynbee said, you know, cuddling up, if that's how people might view it, to Donald Trump will not be a popular image for a lot of British voters.
No, I mean, my personal view is that the special relationship is special because it endures and it matters regardless of who is in office on either side of the Atlantic. Well. So I don't think that Theresa May was wrong to go to Washington. I think perhaps she might regret the fact that President Trump grabbed her hand, and Corbyn can now refer to that in a stump speech. But I would imagine that there are Tory cheers when Jeremy Corbyn says that he will talk about defence policy in the election campaign.
Yeah, although former military leaders have criticised Theresa May for saying that actually this claim of 2% of GDP being spent on our defences is actually just accounting deceit.
There is a row going on, which is much more important, actually, than what Jeremy Corbyn... Because we all know what Jeremy Corbyn thinks about defence. It's the one thing everybody knows about him, whichever side of the argument they're on. But there's a big row going on between Hammond and May about defence spending. The Ministry of Defence is overspending its budget massively. It has ordered stuff it can't afford to pay for. It's in real trouble. And they want a new strategic review. He says he doesn't want one because he knows that it will uncover the extent to which they're in bad trouble.
Right,
and that's a much more important story.
Well, let's have a look at how some of today's papers covered the leak of Labour's manifesto, Polly, which you talked about briefly there. Christian's newspaper City AM says, never mind the 70s, Corbyn will take us back to the 1940s, referring to the level of state intervention promised in the manifesto. Polly's paper, The Guardian, has a picture of Jeremy Corbyn on the front page and calls it a radical manifesto, which the Labour leader says will transform lives. The Times claims the manifesto has promoted an internal civil war within the party, and it also has a picture of our colleague Giles Woolerton, the BBC cameraman whose foot was run over by Mr Corbyn's car yesterday. And The Sun also has a picture of Giles on its front page, alongside a picture of Unite boss Len McCluskey taking a tumble down some steps. Looked quite painful. The headline is Crash Bang Wally's, claiming that the manifesto launch is a shambles. I mean, in a way, Labour has a point about members or parts of the press who've just got it in for him, whatever he says.
No, I don't think he does. I think it has to be reflected that most of the printed press in this country is sceptical, if not hostile, to some of the positions that he is advocating.
But they would be whatever he said and whatever he did. They're not prepared.
85% of the press is always against Labour. Always.
Well, listen, the reference to the 1940s that was on our front page was from Paul Johnson of the IFS. Nobody can accuse him of being always against Labour. That is one of the most impartial and respected institutes in the country. His observation is that the policies outlined in the manifesto, Labour's manifesto, are so radical that they really would transform the role of the state in so many areas of people's lives and lead to such extraordinary levels of state spending that they really ought to be questioned. And you say, Polly, that nothing in the manifesto would be unpopular. There are some things that are unpopular, but you're absolutely right that time and again, whether it's on nationalising rail, banning fox hunting or zero-hours contracts, these things poll very, very well with the public. And yet, it is Mr Corbyn himself and the wider team around him that will prevent those policies.
That's a very important difference because it is not it is a popular manifesto. When people compare it with the 1983 longest suicide note in history...
Well, it didn't do them any good then, did it?
It broke the Labour Party apart because it had really important things in it that aren't there now, like pulling out of Europe, pulling out of NATO, unilateral disarmament. They were deal breakers within the Labour Party. There is nothing in this manifesto, I don't think, that anybody, somewhat to the left of centre centre couldn't agree with warmly. And quite a lot
What
of
about the
people on
costings,
right
though?
as well.
Is
Well, we
that
don't
the
know
other way?
those yet.
No, we don't. It's coming in the
That's
manifesto. But
going to be the
isn't that
toxic
going to be
question.
the day of reckoning in
If
terms of the
they-
amount of money on social care, the amount of money abolishing tuition fees? I mean, these sound like very popular but very expensive policies.
What we need to see is how they're going to be costed. We also need to see what the priorities are. Are some of these longer term things? Are they really going to abolish all tuition fees, even for the richest families? Will there be gradations? Who knows? It is really important that those are watertight.
Well, and they won't be, because he's talking about spending taxes on the same tax rise on multiple different projects. We heard yesterday from the former Lib Dem pension minister, Steve Webb, who said that the commitment to cancel the rising of the state pension age would cost $300 billion over 20 years.
But
And we
over
know-
20 years,
and we
that's
know-
a bit of a chisel.
Well,
That's
Mr
a
Corbyn's
chisel.
going to have to try and be in power for 20 years if he wants to fully nationalise the rail, because the last franchises won't come up for
Well,
another
indeed, that's a
20
chisel.
years.
People say he's going to seize back the rail. They fall back in mostly in about 15 years or so, and they'll fall back in without any cost because you're not snatching it back. The 1983 manifesto was all about grabbing back huge industries with no compensation. This is
Well, there is quite a bit of
Well,
that
but
in
energy
the
companies and
manifesto.
National
I mean,
Grid.
yeah, although the Conservatives, of course, are wanting to cap prices as well in terms of energy companies. But interestingly, the only bit of costing, apart from the re-spending, as the critics would say, of corporation tax increases, is this idea of taxing those who earn over £80,000 a bit more. A bit more? Why so modest from John McDonnell? I mean,
We don't know how much more.
Well, he said it would only be a modest amount. That doesn't sound like it would be enough to meet those costs.
Well, let's wait and see whether maybe there's a 50p tax for higher people. You could go up to 60p for the people earning, $1 million and
You could,
more.
but you would raise less money as a result of a tax rate that was set
That's
that
not
high.
necessarily
Well, let's
so.
save this discussion for next week when we'll have the manifestos, finally.
Deal.
The opinion polls are forecasting a comfortable Conservative victory in the general election. But after the surprise result of 2015, Brexit and President Trump's win, can we trust polling companies to give us an accurate prediction of the result? Jenny Kumar's been looking at how the pollsters are trying to improve their accuracy.
But here it is, 10 o'clock, and we are saying the Conservatives are the largest party.
It was the day that David Cameron won, and you could argue the pollsters lost. So what went wrong?
They didn't get their samples right. They weren't able to get to people who, if they did persist, they did pursue them, difficult to get, but they were more conservative. They didn't get them, so they got the more Labour.
After the surprise result of the 2015 general election, pollsters took a good hard look at the way they did things and brought in changes to improve accuracy. Despite this, many still failed to forecast Brexit. So are they right about next month's election? And just how sure can we be that the polls' favourite will be moving into number 10 on June the 9th? YouGov's online polls put Labour and the Conservatives neck and neck in 2015. To improve their accuracy, they've recruited more people to their survey panels who aren't interested in politics and are less likely to vote, so that their samples are more representative. Despite this, they mainly forecast a Remain result in 2016.
What actually happened in the EU referendum was there was a higher turnout than people expected, and some social groups that don't normally vote so often actually did come out and vote and voted to leave.
How confident are you that your forecasts for the 2017 election are right?
Even if you look at polls where we got it really wrong, so 1992, the famous error, 2015, where things got very wrong, the polls only got it wrong by about 7 points. If the Conservatives have got a lead of about 19 points, then if you were just as wrong as that, that would still leave the Conservatives 12 points ahead.
In the polling industry, you're only as good as your last game. Comres's polls were the least wrong in 2015. They then brought in new techniques to better reflect turnout. But their final EU referendum poll showed an 8-point lead for Remain.
For the 2017 election, if voters behave in the way that they did in the 2015 general election, then our turnout modelling should enhance our accuracy. The big question in my mind is the impact of the 2016 referendum and whether for some voters that's meant that for the first time they voted and they're getting a taste for it. I think more likely we've got a slightly different problem, which is that some people may feel that the result is a foregone conclusion and they'll sit on their hands, they'll sit at home and do something else on election night.
So, do the public trust the forecasters? I thought I'd do my own opinion poll.
Probably some merit to them. I think they've got, a couple of them of late have been a little bit way off.
I think the people that partake and vote or that they screen aren't a true representation of the population.
It's a safe bet to say that it's definitely going to go one way, and the opinion polls will be proven right this time. But I think we'll still be surprised at how right it is.
We'll know for sure whether pollsters have done better this time on June the 9th. Before then, we can only guess.
Jenny Kumar reporting there. And we've been joined by Will Jennings, Professor of Politics at Southampton University. Welcome to the Daily Politics. You were part of the polling inquiry, Will. What is your sense of why the pollsters got it so wrong, particularly in 2015?
Well, in 2015, after the election, there were various speculation around whether it was to do with shy Tories, people being not willing to tell pollsters they were going to vote Conservative, or lazy Labour, that Labour voters hadn't turned out. But what the inquiry concluded was, while there was slight evidence for a late swing in the polls towards the Conservatives just in the final day or two of the campaign, what really had caused the miss was unrepresentative samples, that the pollsters weren't getting enough people who had low political engagement.
Yes.
They were over-representing people who are highly politically engaged, and also were slightly under-representing older voters from the population.
Right. Now, are you worried that that could happen again this time round? Because when you said that certain groups were over-represented, it was felt that support for Labour was over-represented. Could Labour's support be lower or even higher than the polls are currently estimating?
Well, there's a historical pattern of the polls, certainly over the last 20 years, of the polls tending to overstate Labour support. It's very difficult to know this election because there's been such huge methodological change across the polling industry. Pollsters have made a lot of changes. They've made a lot of different changes. So some have tinkered with their turnout probabilities about how likely people are to vote. Many have looked at the quality of their panels. So it's really difficult to know whether that historical pattern of Labour support being overstated, but I certainly think we shouldn't assume that it will be. And I think we also can't assume that the patterns that we saw in 2015 or in 2016 in the referendum will necessarily hold in 2017.
Now, do we need to see polling companies spend a bit more money on the fieldwork and the surveys that they carry out in order to ensure that they're getting that representation?
Well, I think pollsters are doing an incredibly difficult job in a very economically constrained situation. Actually, kind of newspapers and broadcasters actually don't pay a lot of money for polls, and recruiting high-quality panels that are representative of the population is expensive. And so I think that they are, within the kind of the financial constraints they're operating, doing the best they can and really trying to innovate their methodologies. But actually, the real challenge of polling is that you're dealing with a moving target between elections, and you only get one test to see whether your methodological changes have worked.
What about manifesto launches, TV debates? What difference do they make to changes in polling?
Well, there's a lot of debate academically about how much campaigns matter and so forth. The evidence we've got from looking at a large number of elections, both in the UK and cross-nationally, is that the polls tend to converge on the final result pretty steadily. So as you approach election day, the polls tell you more and more about the result. So we shouldn't expect to see large swings in public opinion in either direction as we head towards June the 8th.
Will Jennings, thank you very much. Christian May, do you still trust the polls? I mean, a lot was made, obviously, and rightly so, of getting it so wrong in 2015. But, of course, there have been other polls since and before then, and the pollsters have been more accurate with those.
What Will says is that you need a high-quality panel that represents the nation, which surely we have here.
Yes. Look, we need a few more of you, I think, to make it representative in that sense. Do you think they are still worth trusting?
Yes, I do, as an indication, and particularly when you have... I mean, there are so many different things that one can poll on. When you look at, for example, on values or issues, you tend to get a much sort of starker difference. If the public thinks 70-30 on a particular topic, you can take that as a good indication. If you're having a polling on a straight yes, no or up-down candidate race, you might have a 3-4% margin of error. But if you look at current polling, where the Tories have a sort of 20% lead, read, then 3% margin of error ain't going to change the ball game.
Right. I mean, I suppose that is broadly what pollsters will be thinking at this point.
I think pollsters would have to pack up shop, go away and do something totally else if they were wrong this time. I mean, if between 15 and 20% point lead, if that were wildly wrong, it really would be, the game would be up. I mean, what's interesting is what people are polled on, that people like policies. They like Labour policies, but when they're told which party or which leader represents which policies, then they change their mind, which I'm afraid shows that leadership matters more than everything else. It wipes almost everything out.
But 'twas ever thus, wasn't it?
Well, I think it's become more so. I think every election gets more presidential.
Well,
and it was last
Theresa May
time,
obviously
it is
made this
time.
presidential. But let's get a roundup of the rest of today's election campaign news, because here's Adam.
Hello, Joe. Thank you for letting me come inside and sit in the office for once. I'm very
You mean you've
grateful
got a
for
chair?
that.
You found a chair?
Yes, it's warm. It's not raining. I'm undercover. Anyway, it's Friday. Things aren't quite as manic in the election campaign as they have been in the last few days, it is fair to say. But there's still been plenty of news in the last 24 hours, including the return of some old faces. Here's what's been happening.
He thought he'd said goodbye to the cringy photo op, but former PM David Cameron was back on the campaign trail at a biscuit factory in Crewe.
It's so important, not only that the Conservatives win and win well, so Theresa can negotiate that Brexit deal, so she can stand up to people that want an extreme Brexit either here or in Brussels.
And who's this? Another has-been. Tony Blair has been talking Brexit in Ireland.
The game no one wants to play is back. The race to number 10.
Check out this party election broadcast from the Greens, which is actually genuinely funny. Although they know carefully crafted pastiches are my thing, right? Father's Day isn't enough for the Lib Dems. They want a whole Father's Month with a pledge to introduce more paid paternity leave. Out filming for the BBC Politics Facebook page with some cardboard cutouts, I stumbled into film director Guy Ritchie, who seemed a bit confused.
Guy, who are you going to vote for in the election out of these two? Who do you prefer?
I don't know who they are. Who are they?
Jeremy Corbyn, Theresa May.
I don't know who they are.
What a geezer. Surely he'd recognise Bojo, who made a rare foray onto the campaign trail. Go on, say some funny long words. Go on.
Yes, yes.
And Guy Ritchie, if you're watching, don't worry, you will be able to see Theresa May in action this afternoon because she's in the north of England doing a speech about patriotism. And while everyone is declaring whether they're a pacifist or not, the UKIP leader Paul Nuttall says he is not, but he would only send British soldiers overseas if it was truly in the British national interest. And personally, the biggest bit of news this morning, David Dimbleby is sat just over there. Hi, David.
I spotted him earlier. He wants your chair, I'm afraid, so you're going to have to move. Thank you very much, Adam. Now, elsewhere on the campaign trail, the SNP have accused the Conservatives of poisoning the well of Brexit negotiations by not yet guaranteeing the continued rights of EU citizens living in the UK, something the SNP have branded utterly contemptible. Well, we're joined now from Dundee by the SNP's Europe spokesman, Stephen Gethins. Welcome back to the Daily Politics. I mean, Theresa May has said, as you know, resolving the rights of EU citizens in the UK is her top priority in negotiations. She wants to deal with it first. That's hardly poisoning the well, is it?
But the issue of EU citizens is something that she could resolve now. I mean, I was in the University of St Andrews yesterday with the First Minister, and there, you know, it's one of many institutions and workplaces that EU citizens make a huge contribution financially and making our towns and cities and communities a better place in which to live and work. The UK government could have solved this problem a long time ago.
As could the EU,
and they
of course.
should do so now. Well, it's something that's up to the UK government. They can say, look, if you live here, you're an EU citizen, you live here, you've made your home here, then stay. They can do that. And in terms of poisoning the well, we're seeing Theresa May. Remember, after this election, after all this has been and gone, there's a big job for parliamentarians in the next parliament, which is to scrutinise the work of the government over what kind of relationship we have with Europe. That'll impact on the environment, on EU citizens. And we've got Theresa May chasing after, trying to criticise and trying to hurl abuse at our European partners that she's going to have to negotiate with on our behalf.
But this is a negotiation, as you have just said, Stephen Gethings.
Sure.
And what can be utterly contemptible about first offering to deal with this issue up front before the formal negotiations started? Well, that was rejected by the EU for whatever reason. So the government did make an attempt to deal with resolving the issue of the fate of EU citizens. And secondly, they do have to look at British citizens in EU countries. It is a two-way street.
But look, this is something. But look, if you take the issue of EU citizens who live here, who we should be honoured have made Scotland and elsewhere in the UK their home. Now, if you look at the massive financial contribution alone, and it's much more than that, but if you look at the finances, we'd be financially worse off without all these EU citizens.
But Theresa May hasn't said she doesn't want these EU citizens to stay here, but you're implying that she wants them to go.
It is good for the UK to keep EU citizens here. They contribute so much in the universities round about where I live, near St Andrews, Dundee, Abertay, in our tourist sector, in our food and drink sector. They make a huge contribution. The UK government can sort this out now. And actually, given the way Theresa May, and for that matter, Ruth Davidson, have been sitting there and the sort of abuse they've hurled at the people that we need to negotiate with in a few weeks' time, actually, this could be a little bit of goodwill.
All right.
So they could have solved this problem actually months ago, and yet they've let this uncertainty go on for almost a year now. That's unacceptable.
Right, and I'm sure that is very unsettling for the EU citizens who are living here. But what about the 1.1 million British expats in the EU? Are you not then leaving them, to some extent, out in the cold?
Well, look, this is why the most substantial piece of work that's been done in terms of our future relationship with Europe was the one that was done by the Scottish Government just before Christmas time, whereby it looked at us as a compromise, looking at us staying in the single market and having freedom of movement.
Sure, and I saw that document, but I just want to concentrate on the EU citizens and a reciprocal deal for the 1.1 British expats in the EU. You did ask about
the UK citizens as well. You did ask about that issue as well, and that would have solved that particular problem. Now, look, we're not alone in thinking that freedom of movement is good because it benefits UK citizens living elsewhere in Europe as well as EU citizens here. In fact, it benefits us all.
Yes.
So that compromise document would have solved that problem.
But that
the UK
compromise document hasn't been used. And if we're looking now at your proposal to give a unilateral, let me just ask the question, to give a unilateral offer to the EU by saying we will guarantee the rights of residency and the right to work of all the EU citizens that are here, what happens to the 1.1 million British expats? Are you prepared for them to have a less good deal if that's what came back from the EU?
No, we're not saying that in the slightest, and that's why we put forward the compromise document that would have secured their rights as well. In fact, the SNP is the only political party who have put together a document that would secure the rights of EU citizens as well as those of UK citizens as well. We've had nothing from the UK government. And actually, that's been an interesting point for this election campaign, whereas you've seen a lot of detail from the Scottish Government and the SNP. We've had bluff and bluster from the Tories in terms of their dealing with Europe. We had an EU referendum campaign to try and solve a Tory civil war, and now we're having a general election campaign to stave off yet another Tory civil war and take full advantage of a Labour Party civil war. We should be getting to grips with these substantial problems that we've got as a result of having to deal with our relationship with Europe, and Theresa May's language and using people as bargaining chips is making that situation worse.
All right, let's move on to domestic policies. Nicola Sturgeon has previously ruled out increasing the top rate of tax, with the civil service analysis to the Scottish Government suggesting a risk of £30 million in lost revenues if the wealthy, I suppose, simply up and leave. So why do you want to increase the top rate of tax from 45 pence to 50 pence now? What's changed?
Well, nothing's changed. This is the same situation as has been in the past two SNP manifestos, and unlike the Tories...
Well, you wanted a national 50 pence. Let's be clear with the viewers.
Answer the question. Well, why don't you let the past two manifestos... Now, I think you're picking up on the Finance Minister's remarks that were reported in some newspapers today. And what we've been clear about is that we don't want to see Scotland doing that on its own while we're still part of the Union and we don't have that many financial powers, but we'd like to see it across the United Kingdom. Because here's the thing, we're in a Westminster election and we've been clear that where we can, we will work with other political parties for progressive politics, just as we did in the last Parliament as well. And this is one area where obviously we could work with other parties in the UK Parliament.
Do you have the powers? Does the Scottish Government have the powers to raise income tax?
Well, if it does so, you're putting if you're doing so just in Scotland and not elsewhere.
But you do have the powers. You just said in your last answer that you have.
Now that is why, Joe. That's why the Council of Economic Advisors. And remember, the First Minister took that innovative step of having a Council of Economic Advisors. Is somebody that she refers to on this very subject.
Stephen.
But on the point of Westminster and on the point of these elections, you know, it is something that we can go and we can work with other parties on issues on a pan-UK level while we're part of the United Kingdom. Big decisions are made about people in Scotland and elsewhere in the UK, and we have a responsibility to work in a constructive manner at Westminster.
Right. I mean, if you're going to continue talking at such great length, we can't put the questions to you. Now,
Go on,
in terms of the tax rate, you seem to imply that the Scottish Government doesn't have very much in the way of power. Of course, you do have powers to raise income tax yourselves, and you could have done so on numerous... You said you had very few powers, I think were the words you used. But it was such a long time ago now, I can't remember because you kept on chatting. In terms of raising the levels of income tax, you can do that. You can do that yourselves if you think it's important enough to raise the revenue. But what I'm trying to get to is why is now different to the other two manifestos where you only talked about it being done across the UK?
Well, look, we're going into a Westminster general election whereby decisions will be made on a pan-UK basis. Now, we want to see a reduction in austerity because if you look at £3 billion worth of cuts that are coming the way of the Scottish Government are coming from Westminster. And if we get those cuts, if we have that austerity, that's less money to spend on education, it's less money to spend on health, it's less money to spend on crucial public services. In Scotland. So Westminster has a huge role. It's important we have a strong team of MPs at Westminster to make that case, and that's why we've been described as the effective opposition to the Tories at Westminster.
Is this election for you about the second independence referendum or not?
Well, independence is something that we're in favour of. You know, like the European result has showed that that's something we're in favour of.
So why is it not on your SNP campaign leaflets?
The Scottish Parliament has, well, we're just at the start of the campaign. I mean, I was with my campaign team. We've got a number of other campaign leaflets to be putting out. But look, we're still in favour.
But you've always known what your line is on independence.
But yeah, we do, and I don't think it's a great secret what our line is on independence.
Right, so why is it not on your campaign leaflets?
The Scottish Parliament has voted in favour of independence. What we want to see is Westminster respecting decisions that are made in the Scottish Parliament.
Because you don't think you're going to get as big a mandate this time round?
That we want to see. Well, let's see. I mean, the Tories have got us into this mess on just 36% of the vote, and the SNP has 95% of the seats in Scotland. So if those are the two different margins that you're comparing this by, I'm not sure that's terribly fair. But we're in this mess based on just 36% of people in the UK voting Conservative. Now, I'm fighting hard against the Tories where I am in North East Fife, but we're up for this fight, and we know that we've got to work hard over the next few weeks.
Stephen Gethin, thank you.
Thank you.
Now, let's take a look at another of the smaller parties campaigning in the general election, the Socialist Party of Great Britain, which is fielding just 3 candidates. The Socialist Party of Great Britain was founded in 1904 with the aim of abolishing capitalism. It's a leaderless organisation with more than 20,000 followers on Twitter. It takes inspiration from Marx but rejects Leninism and Trotskyism. It wants an immediate move to a socialist system, with a system based on common ownership rather than state ownership. As such, they don't believe in other political parties or government. Well, I've been joined now by Danny Lambert, but presumably you're not the leader.
Certainly not.
Because you don't have a leader?
No.
How does that work then in practice?
Well, we have democracy instead.
So how do you make a decision?
Well, what we do is that in our party, every year we have an annual conference. And the conference is attended by delegates from all over the country where issues are discussed. Then they go back to their branches and they're discussed again, and then we vote on the issues. Well, and when I say democracy, I mean we have a system in our party where all relevant information to the party is freely available to every member. Now, every member has the same access to the democratic process.
But if you oppose all governments, which I understand is the case, and other political parties, why are you standing in a general election?
Well, because we're Democrats.
But what's the point? If you don't actually believe in the political system, why are you standing in it?
Well, because we use it as a platform to put forward our analysis and our proposition.
To what end?
To change people's minds, to explain the kind of system they live under, and to put forward a better system of living.
How are you going to do that by only fielding 3 candidates? You're not changing many people's minds, are you?
Well, I mean, by coming on television. I mean,
Sure.
hopefully there's millions of people out there who might...
There are millions watching this programme, absolutely. But I mean, if you're only fielding 3 candidates, it's not a very big offer you're making in terms of trying to convert people.
Well, I mean, you mustn't underestimate people. I mean, people...
No, I'm not underestimating people. I'm slightly underestimating or questioning your ability to appeal to a broad audience.
Well, we're a very small party. You know, we have limited resources. I mean, if we had unlimited resources, then we contest every seat. Well, every seat we could we could delegate a member to do so. But the point is, the point of coming on television, this kind of television programme and using Parliament, is to put forward our case against capitalism and for socialism.
I mean, if we look at Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, why don't you just support him and the Labour Party?
Well, it's not a socialist party. It's a capitalist party. It always has been. I mean, it supported all capitalism's wars, and we're a principal party. I mean, you've just had a chap on from the Labour Party talking about defence. I mean, the Labour Party's principles changed with the change of the political wind.
But I think it was the Communist Party who said they were very happy with Jeremy Corbyn and very happy with the Labour Party manifesto. You're obviously different to them, but what are the differences between you? There's another socialist party, isn't there? There's also the Trade Union Socialist Party. You're the Socialist Party of Great Britain. What marks you out?
Well, you see, what we stand for is socialism. That is the common ownership and the democratic control of the means and instruments for producing wealth. That's carried out by and in the interest of the whole community. What they stand for is state capitalism. They are Leninist, Trotskyist organisations who believe in the state, whereas we do not. We believe that for society to run correctly, it has to be run democratically, and that means that the responsibility has to be shared. Otherwise, it's an irresponsible system. It's an immature system.
This is part, obviously, of the political debate, but does this party have anything really to add in terms of the general election?
Probably quite useful for Corbyn to have somebody to the left of him. Have you found your members leaking towards the Labour Party? Because the Labour Party has brought in lots of people from Tusk and other. Have any of your members, do you think, moved towards the Labour Party?
I think we had one member a couple of years ago who joined Left Unity, and there might be others that I don't know about. But our membership is fairly small, but it's fairly stable, because we have a unique way of viewing society, and we have a unique proposition to put forward as far as the future goes.
What about the nationalisation of the railways? What's your view on that?
Well, it's not common ownership; it's state ownership.
So, what would you do in terms of running the railways?
Well, what we would do, I mean, we see, the point is we do not propose to run capitalism.
No, I understand that, but running the railways, how would they run?
Well, they would run on the basis of common ownership. They would be run. They would be a resource that the whole society would produce and run for itself.
Right. I mean, your party also calls for a wageless, moneyless society,
Yes.
which I suppose, I don't know, I was trying to think of a comparison, but kibbutzim maybe in Israel used to run on some sort of, again, it was so they used to call it socialism, but I'm not sure it'd be common ownership. What's your view about some of the policies that are being put forward by the party?
Well, Danny might be interested to know that the chief economist at the Bank of England has also talked about a cashless society, but probably that's where the comparison stops. He was talking about moving away from hard cash to something purely digital. I think a society stripped of the freedom and liberty that money and financial choice gives people would be an utterly miserable place.
Or is it a burden, money
exist.
and cash in that
I think
sense?
the lack of it is more of a burden.
What do you say?
Well, you see, the thing is all wealth in society is socially produced. So therefore, it should be socially administered. And the other thing, we live in a society that's based on... we live in a society that is based on employment. So you have employers and the employer. Well, it's a French word. It means to use, to exploit, to take advantage of. Now, what we want is a society where we bring freely of our social creativity, and we can therefore take freely from social production. And what you'll have then is a society where no longer do we have to sell ourselves for a price to meet the price of life. We will be free in that we will live a life without price.
Any examples of that going at the moment?
Nothing with the price on it can be free, and that includes human beings. We have to sell ourselves on the labour market, the sordid process of selling ourselves on the labour market to an employer, somebody's going to use us for their ends.
Can you give me an example, though? Can you just finally give me an example of where that could work successfully now and does work?
Venezuela, for example?
Oh, well, that's cheap. I mean, those societies...
Cheap? No. This is much more like Christianity in its purest form.
It's the purest form.
Consider the lilies of the field. It's that kind of utopianism.
But when people try to implement that...
Don't all talk about it because people can't hear it. Right, final word to Danny.
No, it's not utopian. In that, you see, at the heart of capitalism, what allows capitalism to function, is a gross egregious case of mistaken identity.
All right.
Now, we all share the same ancestors, so therefore we're all members of the same family. That is our common identity. Now, with a common identity, it is impossible to exploit, oppress or coerce or abuse in any way those people you identify. And capitalism runs on mistaken identity.
All right, Danny Lambert, I'm going to have to finish it there because we're almost out of time, but thank you.
Thank you.
We may be saying adios, adieu, and auf Wiedersehen to the European Union, but as the Prime Minister assured us earlier this week, it will still be willkommen, bienvenue and welcome for the Brits when it comes to the Eurovision Song Contest in Kiev tomorrow. But will our erstwhile European partners deliver a Brexit revenge with nul point? I've always wanted to say that. Let's remind ourselves with this bit of European integration and what it's all about.
Gladly be there like a puppet on a string. Hey, Eurovision! Oh, Annie! Spin my head, are you causing a riot? Yeah, girl, you're causing a riot.
Refrain, couleur du ciel, parfum de mes 20 ans.
Power to the boys who played rock and roll, made my life so sweet. And to the girls I knew before, but soon you will find that there comes a time for making your mind up, for making your mind up, for making your mind up, for making your mind up.
I remember it well. We've been joined by Chris West, author of Eurovision, A History of Modern Europe Through the World's Greatest Song Contest. You must have a lot of fun doing this.
I loved it. It was wonderful. I have seen every Eurovision song that's ever been sung.
Is that right?
Except for 2 years where they've lost all the tapes.
Oh, which years were they?
The first one, 56, and in 1964, they've lost the tape, and someone once found a box with Eurovision 1964 on it, and they opened it. And it was
There's nothing in there. Crime of the century. What impact do you think Brexit's going to have on Eurovision and our role?
I don't know, and I think this is really interesting because Eurovision is a kind of signalling mechanism whereby other countries will pass judgment on another country. So, for example, in 2003, Iraq, we came last, nul point. It wasn't a great song, it wasn't a great performance, but out there I think people were saying we didn't approve of that. So, what are we going to get this year? I don't know. See, it might be that these countries like Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal...
Will they take their revenge?
...who are having a horrible time in the Euro might say, well, rather, we don't like the EU either. We're going to vote for Britain.
Oh, you think that they may give us the 12 points then?
So, we'll see. We've got a reasonable song, a nice song, I like it. Good singer. And normally, we should come top 10. If we're top 5... I think that shows that these countries are rather rooting for us.
I mean, politics is a big deal then, isn't it, in this Eurovision Song Contest? I mean, I have to say I did slightly, or my heart slightly sank when I see all the Eastern European countries voting for each other rather than on the songs.
Well, that was sort of stopped in 2009. They changed the judging system. You should start watching it.
God, I'm behind the times, clearly.
You'll enjoy it.
Do you watch, the two of you?
I do, because my grandchildren love it.
Oh, yeah.
Brilliant.
It's very much a kid's thing, isn't it?
It's a family thing.
I mean, what's good to remember, what's good about your book is that it was started at the same time as the beginning of the whole European idea.
Exactly.
And it came from that sort of idealism.
Yeah.
And it is kind of bonkers and crazy. And now we have, Egypt and Libya and all
Yes, Europe's become bigger, hasn't it? Europe has sort of grown.
Europe's become
and
enormous.
Australia, which is wonderful. I love Australia, really.
Yes, so we're taking a broad view of what is actually Europe.
Yes.
But actually, Polly does make an interesting point about what it was there for at the beginning and how it sort of progressed. That's the case, isn't
Absolutely.
it?
The founder of Eurovision was a guy called Marcel Besançon, who was a great friend of Jean Monnet, who was the
founding
founder
father
of the REU. So, I mean, it does come from the same root.
Do you think this will...
sad? I mean, I think, you know, Theresa May pulled a terrible face because she plainly thinks we'll be punished. And we certainly deserve to be.
Maybe we will get some Eurosceptic solidarity from the countries that are also a bit Eurosceptic. Maybe we'll get a sympathy vote. But I've never watched it. But on the idea that we might go into the top 5, maybe I'll start.
It's never too late to start.
All right, I'm going to quickly finish it there. Thank you very much for coming in and enjoy it. There's just time before we go to find out the answer to our quiz. And the question was, is it A, do you remember how much the election is going to cost? £123 million, B, £143 million, C, £350 million, or D, €100 billion? And we have someone to give us the answer if you don't know it. So,
is it just the amount that parties spend, or is it the whole cost?
I think the whole general election.
As long as these returns are all signed off properly, then...
I'll say 140.
100. Was that one of the... I can't even remember if that was one of the... It was 100. Well, anyway, let's find out if Mark Lebel, my colleague, the political correspondent, is then can give us the right answer. Mark, are you there?
Yes,
what is
Polly,
the answer?
Indeed, Polly is right, because after some digging and number crunching, we found out that the government expects the UK general election to cost the taxpayer £143 million. And that's £101 million spent on printing those postal votes, ballot papers, the tens of thousands of polling stations being manned and counting millions of votes, and £42 million on election mailings distributions for the candidates. And that's according to the Cabinet Office and Northern Ireland Office.
Mark Lebel, thank you very much for crunching the numbers. Well done, Polly. Yes, you look very pleased. Well done. Now, that's it for today. Thanks to all of our guests, but particularly to you, Christian and Polly, for being our guests of the day. And the 1 o'clock news is starting over on BBC One now. From all of us here, though, bye-bye.